Great afternoon and hello to everyone. It is a great day to be alive. And to my Spanish-speaking brothers and sisters in the audience, es un gran día para estar vivo. I'm happy to welcome you all to our 10th, yes, I'll repeat, our 10th Beyond Buzzwords event. My name is Robert Earl Gunn Jr., and I'm the proud Chief Equity and Impact Officer here at Metro United Way. And I have the pleasure of announcing today's guest speaker, Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, to discuss his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. We know there are more than 500 registered for today's event, and that does not include many organizations like the Kentucky Science Center, Bellarmine, Heaven Hill, and Humana that are with us today sharing this to a larger audience. Also, special shout out to the Metro United Way family that is also watching today's event in-house. I want to thank the LG&E Foundation for their partnership and dedication to equity for the 2023 Beyond Buzzwords Speaker Series to reach thousands in our community. We've had such excellent speakers in the past 3 years, including Dr. Michael Eric Dyson, Isabel Wilkerson, Dr. Robin DeAngelo, to name just a few. Today, we are fortunate to hear from Dr. Ibram X. Kendi to add to this distinguished list, who is one of Time Magazine's 2020 most influential people in the world. His book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, explores his concepts of anti-racism that re-energizes and reshapes the conversation about racial justice in America, but even more fundamentally, points us toward liberating new ways of thinking about ourselves and each other. Instead of working with the policies and systems we have in place, Dr. Kendi asks us to think about what an anti-racist society might look like and how we can play our part to building it. Here at Metro United Way, our role consists of building relationships with community partners like LG&E to continue the Beyond Buzzwords Speaker Series, and also launching Fund Black Founders, which is a new approach to creating pathways out of poverty to prosperity by investing in Black entrepreneurs with both financial and social capital, as well as conducting our racial wealth gap simulations, which we offered to the public for free yesterday, and of course, our Black Love philanthropic partnership that designs effective strategies that are more responsive to the needs of the Black community in the greater Louisville region, of which LG&E is also a supporter of. How we do this work continues to progress and evolves each and every day. I am delighted to hear from Dr. Kendi and his perspective on the concept of anti-racism, as this is a critical dialogue needed to build more equitable community and future. Thank you to everyone for joining us today to listen and learn how to create lasting change together. It is now my pleasure to introduce our friend, Mr. Lonnie Bellar, Chief Operating Officer at LG&E. Lonnie, the floor is yours, my friend.
Thank you, Robert. I will not try to do any Spanish speaking in my introduction here. I would only butcher that. So Dr. Ibram X. Kendi is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor in the Humanities at Boston University, and following the director of the BU Center for Anti-Racist Research, and he's the founding director there, I must say. He is a contributing writer at The Atlantic, and we were just talking earlier, CBS News racial justice contributor. I saw him on an interview, very interesting, to do a little research on Dr. Kendi yourself. Dr. Kendi is also the author of many highly acclaimed books, including Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, which won the National Book Award for Nonfiction, making him the youngest ever winner of that award. He also produced 5 straight #1 New York Times bestsellers, including How to Be an Anti-Racist, Antiracist Baby, and Stamped, Racism, Antiracism, and You, which was co-authored by Jason Reynolds. In 2020, Time Magazine named Dr. Kendi one of the 100 most influential people in the world. He was also awarded a 2021 MacArthur Fellowship, popularly known as the Genius Grant. His next 2 books, coming out in June, are How to Raise an Anti-Racist and the picture book, Goodnight Racism. Kendi lives in Boston, Massachusetts. He will be joined today by the moderator of this session, Trent Finley. Trent is our Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Metro United Way, and providing leadership and oversight for Metro United Way's strategic direction to infuse an equity lens throughout the internal and external work led by the organization. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ibram X. Kendi and moderator Trent Finley for today's session.
And thanks for being here today. We are excited about this conversation, proud of the work that you have done, and I'll give you a chance to say anything that you want to say before we get started.
Oh, I just want to thank everyone for coming to this conversation, and I just want to thank you all for this invitation. I'm looking forward to it.
All right, so we will hop right into it, and we've got some questions that you and I will discuss. In How to Be an Anti-Racist, you share your own experience with racist thinking. How does your honesty help give us space to acknowledge and name our own racist behaviors and attitudes?
Well, I think that when I was thinking about writing How to Be an Anti-Racist, I not only wanted to provide research and history and data and really logic, which will allow people to see and understand what it means to be anti-racist. But I, in many ways, wanted the pulse of the book to be anti-racist, which is to say, I wanted the pulse of the book to be the opposite of being racist. And historically, I've found that really the heartbeat or even the pulse of being racist has been denial. And so when you study the history of people who have expressed, let's say, that there's something wrong or inferior about Black people, when you study people who have historically supported policies and practices that specifically targeted and excluded and harmed and exploited Black people or other racial groups, typically those people denied that their ideas were racist. Typically those people denied that their policies were racist. Whether you're talking about human traders who imagined that they were bringing Black people to, quote, civilization, whether you think about enslavers who contended that slavery was a positive good for Black people, or Black people were the cursed descendants of Ham, whether you talk about Jim Crow segregationists who imagined that their societies were separate but equal, or even you imagine police officers today who are engaging in violence against Black people and claiming they, quote, fear for their lives, even though they were the only one with weapons. And so I think that when you look at that history and really even that presence, it's a history of denial. And I really wanted How to Be an Anti-Racist to speak a different language, to have a different pulse. I wanted people to feel free to really interrogate their own ideas, what they had learned over the course of their lifetimes. I wanted people to be self-reflective and self-critical. And I knew the only way I can encourage people to do that is if I did that myself.
Thank you so much. So you write, the only way to undo racism is to constantly identify it and describe it, and then dismantle it. Why do you believe we need to call out racism when we see it, even if it can be uncomfortable to identify?
In many ways, as I write about at the end of How to Be an Anti-Racist, racism is like a disease harming the body politic. And like with any disease, particularly a disease that gets worse if you do not identify it and treat it, similarly, racism will get worse, will harm more people, will divide more communities, will create more inequity and injustice if you do not constantly identify it and seek to dismantle it. And I think for too long, we have imagined that we can eliminate racism by not talking about it. I mean, can you imagine, a physician, a medical researcher saying the way to eradicate cancer is to never diagnose it, to never treat it, because when we diagnose people with cancer, it hurts them, they're devastated. Because when people have to go upon getting treatment for cancer like I did, it's extremely painful. So let's just not do it. Right? I mean, people, that person would be laughed out of any public square if they stated that. But people commonly state that as it relates to racism from the standpoint of when we identify racism in a structural sense, or the ways in which people are being racist, it, quote, makes people uncomfortable or people are hurt. And so that's then used as a justification to not talk about it, to not diagnose it, to not treat it, which to me makes no sense.
Yes, that's an excellent analogy. I know that towards the end of the book, you talk about racism being a cancer, and we'll get to that. But the book's central message is that the opposite of racist isn't not racist. The true opposite of racist is anti-racist. The good news, you write, is that racist and anti-racist are not fixed identities. We can be racist one minute and anti-racist the next. What does it mean to have to constantly reaffirm your identity as an anti-racist? And then is there any benefit to the fact that you can't just decide you are not racist or an anti-racist and be done with it?
Well, I think for me, I think it is critically important, let me just say, to explain why, like, I've framed anti-racist as the opposite of racist. And very simply, when you actually start defining terms, if a racist idea is any concept that suggests racial hierarchy, that a particular racial group is superior or inferior to another racial group in any way, what's the opposite of that? An idea that suggests racial equality, that the racial groups, despite any cultural or color differences, are equals. Well, that's an anti-racist idea. There's really no in-between hierarchy and equality. Our ideas about race are either expressing that we're equals or a particular racial group is superior or inferior. And then as it relates to policy, you see policy as, we can see that policy is either leading to or maintaining inequity between groups, or it's leading to or maintaining equity between groups, right? And policies that are leading to or maintaining inequity are racist, and policies that are leading to or maintaining equity are anti-racist. So that allows us to understand that if we truly, that really, it's not about being not racist, right? It's about expressing racial equality and thereby being anti-racist. It's not about being not racist, it's about supporting equitable policies and thereby being anti-racist. I think that, but then what's also critical is to understand this in the context of complex human beings, which is to say, human beings, for instance, when they're talking about, let's say, Latinx people, they can say, well, those people are equal to me. But when they're talking about indigenous people, they can imagine those people are inferior to them. Or when they're talking about Black people, that same person can imagine they're equal to them, right? And so then how do you account for that person who, depending on the racial group, they say that particular group is superior or inferior? How do you call that person essentially racist or anti-racist? But what you can say is when they're calling a particular racial group as equals to their own, they're being anti-racist. When they're describing a particular racial group as inferior to their own, they're being racist. When they're supporting an equitable policy, they're being anti-racist. When they're supporting an unjust policy, they're being racist. To me, the benefit of this is it not only is more accurate based on the complexity of humans and how humans operate in society and their different views on different racial groups or different issues in different situations, but it also allows us to change, right? No one is essentially racist. No one is born racist. No one has a racist tattoo on their forehead. The question is not what you just did. The question is, are you going to acknowledge what you just did and change and grow and thereby be anti-racist? I think too many people don't want to acknowledge they're being racist because they think it's who they are. They think it's an identity. They think it's fixed, as opposed to recognizing, yes, you just said something that was racist, but in this moment, you can acknowledge that and be anti-racist.
Thank you for that. So, Dr. Kendi, you've expressed that you think we should assess candidates as being racist or anti-racist based on what ideas they're expressing and what policies they're supporting, and not what they say is in their bones or in their heart. Can you speak to this a little bit more?
Sure. It's, I think the specifically when it comes to elected officials or even judges, in terms of elected officials who we can see what laws they're introducing, what laws they're opposing, what laws they're supporting, which then allows us to assess, okay, are they introducing laws that are equitable? Are they opposing laws that can create equity? Or are they opposing laws that they know will create more inequity? And that allows us to really assess whether a candidate, or I should say an elected official, is being racist or anti-racist, because we live in a society in which every elected official, no matter what laws they're supporting or opposing or introducing, is self-identifying as not racist, like across the board, right? So what they're saying about themselves cannot be an accurate indicator of what they're actually doing. Because if it was truly the case that every single elected official was, quote, not racist, then we would have a pretty equitable society. We would not have all these racial disparities from wealth to health all around us, right? But we do. And part of the reason why we do is because they're elected officials who claim they are not racist, and then they go about supporting policies that are creating or maintaining racial injustice. Or they say things like, racism doesn't exist. And just let's just give some context, because, a century ago, you would have people saying things like, Black people are dangerous and violent, evil people, right? They would say that very directly. Today, they don't say that. What they typically say is racism doesn't exist. So then when you convince your constituents or other people that racism doesn't exist in a society where Black people are disproportionately being killed by police, Black people are disproportionately being arrested and incarcerated, what's the only other explanation why Black people are disproportionately incarcerated or being killed by police? Because they're dangerous, violent people, right? And so I think it's important for us, even when people do not directly state that a particular racial group is inferior, for us to be keen on what the implications of what they're saying truly are.
Absolutely. I want to pause for a second and remind our audience that if you have a question for Dr. Kendi today, please use that Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And at the end of our conversation, we will do an audience Q&A. Dr. Kendi, there is a stronger and clearer correlation between levels of violent crime and unemployment levels than between violent crime and race. But that's not the story policymakers have chosen to tell. Discuss why you think that is, and how might our society and culture change if policymakers characterize dangerous Black neighborhoods as dangerous unemployed neighborhoods?
Well, and just to add to that, one of the ways in which we know that is because people have been taught that, let's say there's higher levels of violence or homicides in a predominantly Black neighborhood because of Black people. So in other words, they have been taught that you have Black people, you're going to have high levels of violence. So it's the Blackness of our people, our genetic or cultural or behavioral predisposition, people have imagined in a racist fashion to be the cause of those higher levels. If that truly is the case, then all Black communities, no matter their unemployment levels and income levels, would have similar levels of violence. And that's just not the case. You have upper income Black neighborhoods in this country that have far and away lower levels of violence than, let's say, highly impoverished Black neighborhoods. And that just so happens to be the case across Latinx America, Indigenous America, white America, Asian America. You have higher levels of particularly long-term unemployment and poverty. You tend to have higher levels of, of violence, particularly homicides. So that's why, to me, it's more statistically accurate to describe a particular neighborhood as a dangerous, unemployed neighborhood rather than a dangerous Black neighborhood. But if you're an elected official and you've spent your political capital pushing for more prisons, for more surveillance, and more police to curb a problem in a dangerous, unemployed neighborhood, that's not going to make much sense, right? Because those people and your constituents will know that, well, actually, that's not going to do much. What those people need are jobs. And what are you doing, elected official, to create jobs other than for police officers?
Yes. Dr. Kendi, why do you think it's so hard for people to not assess other cultures from their own cultural standards? And how does doing this trap people in racist ideas?
In many ways, we've been taught, we have not been taught what's called cultural relativity, which is to say that we cannot, none of us, whether it's African Americans and we have a particular culture, or white Americans or Nigerians or any particular group, cannot standardize our culture and then assess another culture from our own cultural standards. Because what's going to happen is whoever creates the cultural standard, their culture is going to be deemed superior. And historically, particularly white Americans and even European Americans more broadly, I should say Europeans more broadly, have standardized their cultures and then assessed the cultures of peoples of color from their own cultural standpoint. So their language is non-standard. Their religion is barbaric. Their ways of being is savage, and on, as opposed to their religion, their language, their traditions, their food, their dance is different, right? It's different. Why can't we recognize difference and equate difference? And I think that would then allow us as human beings living in a deeply multicultural world to be able to live with other groups, right? More amicably. And when we equate difference, we're going to respect difference. And when we respect difference, we can now learn about other cultures. And the more we learn about other cultures, the more we learn about our own culture. And the more we learn about our own culture, the more we learn about ourselves.
Absolutely. In the book, I know you have a chapter that examines ethnicity. So a question on immigration. Anyone who values immigrants from European countries and devalues immigrants from Latin America is guilty of racism. Well, can you discuss the unique resilience and resourcefulness people possess if they leave everything in their native country behind and immigrate to another?
Sure. So sociologists who have been studying immigrants and even migrants, and when I say migrants, not just people who are coming to the United States from Italy or Ghana or Honduras or Jamaica, but even people who are traveling up to Detroit and Chicago from Mississippi and Georgia, that people who migrate, particularly long distances, sociologists have found that this specific group is uniquely resourceful, and is that unique resourcefulness that's critical in basically guiding their way to do what many people choose not to do, which is to literally migrate across the world. It's an incredibly difficult thing to do, to uproot yourself and your family and move to another place where you don't know anyone or where you don't know the society. And the challenge, though, is what Americans have oftentimes done, particularly with Black immigrants, is they have said, well, Black immigrants are doing so much better than African Americans. So therefore, their quote success shows that African Americans are overhyping this racism thing, right? If they would only work harder, like immigrants from Haiti and Nigeria, then they would be able to get ahead. But what those commentators don't understand is, first and foremost, that Black immigrants actually have higher unemployment levels than any other group of immigrants. They don't want to talk about that. The second thing they don't understand is it's actually a false comparison to compare any immigrant group to the people they encounter in the country that they arrive in and the people that they left in their host country. Because again, immigrants, according to sociologists, are a uniquely resourceful group of people. So it's a better variable to compare them to other immigrants. And again, when you compare Black immigrants to other immigrants, they're more likely to be unemployed because of racism. And so I think that the irony in sociologists finding just how great immigrants typically are is that we live in a country that demonizes immigrants, right? So we're literally turning away people who are uniquely resourceful, who can be critical pillars in our community, along with the people who are already there. And you know, people are saying, particularly about Latinx immigrants, that, oh, Latinx immigrants are, you know, criminals and rapists, when studies show they're actually less likely to commit crimes than US citizens, right? They imagine that, oh, immigrants, particularly Black and brown immigrants, are taking away jobs. When studies show immigrants are actually creating jobs in communities. And in communities with a tremendous amount of racism, white males actually stand at the front of the lines for those new jobs. So they're actually opposing job creation by opposing immigrants, which essentially means they're opposing their own livelihood and don't even know it.
Yes, yes. So Dr. Kendi, you write, white supremacist is code for anti-human, a nuclear ideology that poses an existential threat to human existence. How are white supremacists and their ideology actually harmful to all of humanity, including white people?
Oh man, where do we get started? So let's see, white supremacists typically claim that there's not a climate crisis. Last I checked, there is a climate crisis. And last I checked, it's harming white people too. White supremacists typically oppose legislation that can do things like eliminate poverty. Last I checked, there were more white people in the United States that were poor than any other racial group. White supremacists typically have, particularly over the last 10 years, have championed the removal of gun safety laws in their states, which has allowed for not only the flooding of guns that have led to all these mass shootings, and last I checked, you had white women, men, and children who are dying in mass shootings like the rest of us, but also in the specific states where you've had this removal of gun safety laws promoted by white supremacists on the standpoint that, well, we need more guns to protect our families from those so-called Latinx invaders, so-called Black criminals, and so-called Muslim terrorists. In those specific states, there's actually been a pretty significant climb in a number of white male suicides by handguns. So you have white supremacists pushing the removal of gun safety laws on the basis that white people need to protect themselves because they're, quote, being replaced. And what's actually happening is white people are killing themselves because of access to guns. Or you have white supremacists like the Nazis who helped trigger a World War II that led to tens of millions of white people dying in Europe. Or you have white supremacists like the Confederates who triggered a civil war that led to more white Americans dying during the Civil War than every other American war combined. Or, I mean, where do you even start? I mean, that's why, let alone white supremacists being anti-people of color, they're even anti-white.
Dr. Kendi, you make the case that to be anti-racist, one must stand against all forms of bigotry. Why is standing against other bigotry so essential to standing against racism?
I first realized this when I was writing a book entitled Stamped from the Beginning, which was this narrative history of anti-Black racist ideas, particularly in the United States, but throughout Western Europe. And one of the things I found engaging in research for that book is many of the major producers of anti-Black racist ideas, which really the book focused on people who were like producing these ideas. Many of these producers, particularly when they wrote books or made speeches in which they produced these ideas, the anti-Black racist ideas were only one chapter or one section of the speech. In other words, in other chapters, they had their sexist ideas, they had their classist ideas demonizing poor people. In certain cases, they had their homophobic ideas, they had their ableist ideas. So these were just typically all-American bigots. In other words, all these different groups, they imagine to be inferior, whether it's people of color, whether it's women, whether it's members of the queer community, whether it's people with disabilities, whether it's poor people, you name the group. And so that was really my first recognition of just how connected anti-Black racist ideas and its production has historically been to the production of ideas demonizing other groups. But the more I studied it, the more I realized that historically, racism has not only been produced in conjunction with other forms of bigotry, it literally has intersected with other forms of bigotry in the bodies of people. So in other words, you've had Black women who've not only faced racism, they've not only faced sexism, but they've faced their intersection, which has historically been called gender racism. Or you have Black people with disabilities who are the most likely to be killed by the police, who are the most likely to be incarcerated, not just because of racism and not just because of ableism, but because of their intersection. Or you have Black poor people who, one study recently found that if you were Black and poor, you were 10 times more likely to live in a high poverty neighborhood in Chicago than someone who was white and poor. That's not just a reflection of racism or classism, but most importantly, it's intersection, which leads to Black poverty being worse in the United States than white poverty. And so really, in studying, again, the history of racism, I can't disentangle it from the bigotries that have historically intersected with.
Yeah, so fighting against racism and bigotry, I know it can be exhausting. What's clear to me in reading How to Be an Anti-Racist is that you do believe we can defy the odds and heal society of racism and create an anti-racist society. Why is hope so central to the anti-racist movement?
I think first through not only studying the history of Black people who fought against racism, but people from the Middle East who have fought against racism, Latinx people, Native people, white people, really Asian Americans who fought against racism, really, everyone, when you study the history of anti-racism, you see that one of the guiding spirits of resistance has been hope, have been people who have believed that we can eradicate slavery, or we could eradicate Jim Crow, or we could eradicate inequality and injustice today. And so I think that's first and foremost what gives me hope, is sort of walking in that history. But also I know it's very, very difficult to put in the level of work and energy that's needed to create change if you do not believe it's possible. And so for me, my hope fuels my work to create change.
Thank you. So the last question that we'll discuss here before taking audience questions pertains to what I mentioned earlier at the end of the book, towards the end of the book. You close the book comparing racism and cancer. Tell us a little bit more about what you think of this comparison.
Well, first, 5 years ago, around this time, a physician, after doing a colonoscopy on me, walked into a room and told me that I had cancer. And the next day I learned that cancer was stage 4. And I had a disease that kills 88% of people in 5 years. And clearly, when this physician came and told me that I had stage 4 cancer, it was devastating. I was completely shocked. I didn't really have that many risk factors I didn't really have any risk factors, for colon cancer. I mentioned that I was shocked and devastated and hurt because when we diagnose people as being racist, or when we diagnose racism within institutions, typically people do not recognize it as a diagnosis. Because they feel devastated, they feel that the person sought to hurt them or attack them, and they do not see the diagnosis in the way I saw it and other people who have been diagnosed with cancer as a door to treatment. So we're telling you this based on our expertise so that you can heal yourself, so that you can heal your institution, so that you can heal your community, so that people won't continue to die from racism in the way they continue to die from cancer. But people don't take it that way, right? People don't see others as diagnosing them as racist, as trying to help them. They see the people who keep telling them, no, you're not racist, as the people who are trying to help them. Can you imagine if I would have saw the people who told me, oh, no, what you're experiencing right now, all these symptoms of colon cancer, that's nothing. Leave it alone. Don't get checked out. Don't listen to that doctor. I wouldn't be living right now, right? But that's what people normally do. They consistently sort of swim in this denial, which then is leading to them harming themselves and their communities and others. But when they finally overcome that denial and receive treatment, that treatment is actually quite similar to the treatment we receive for metastatic cancer, which is there's typically a local and a systemic treatment. The local treatment is to go in and surgically remove, in this case, the tumor cells of racial inequity by removing the racist policies, right? That's critical. But then that's not enough. Before that or after that, physicians typically flood the body with chemotherapy. What's the job of chemotherapy? It's supposed to either shrink the size of the tumors, in this case, of racial inequity, or if you've already removed the tumors, to prevent their reoccurrence. So you have equitable policies maintaining equity. And of course, both the surgery and the chemotherapy are painful, but there's no healing, whether in society or us as individuals, without pain.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kendi. We're going to take some audience questions here for about the next 10 minutes. As a reminder, if you've got a question for Dr. Kendi today, please put it in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So we'll try to get to as many as we can. If you have a question that does not get answered, because we've got quite a few in the chat I see right now, and you'd like for us to respond, please email us at events@metrounitedway.org. All right, so Dr. Kendi, first question here. What is your response to one of the frequent rebuttals to anti-racism, which is, what about Black on Black crime?
Well, first, I'm going to try to be as concise as possible so that we can get to as many questions as possible. My rebuttal to that is every racial group is most likely to engage in violence and harm towards their own racial group, and Black people are no different. And Black people are more likely to, according to data, engage in homicides, not because of their Blackness, but because, as we talked about earlier, they're most likely in this country to live in high poverty and highly unemployed neighborhoods.
Okay, next question. What are the most important ways that institutions can change to become anti-racist institutions?
I think first, it's incredibly important for institutions to collect racial data, not only in terms of their sort of personnel, but even the work that they're doing, which then allows them to assess where the disparities are, which then allows them to assess what policies and practices could be causing those disparities, which allows them to replace them with more equitable policies and practices.
Do you agree with the statement, poor economic outcomes in Black communities are the result of a lack of funding and intervention to curb systematic problems that prevent wealth accumulation? And then follow-up question to that, how can anti-racism inform us on how to approach community investment?
So I do agree with that statement. And I think the way that anti-racism can help is for us to really unpack one of the reasons why there's less investments in Black communities. Again, there's less investments in Black communities, either because there's this perception that those communities are risky places to invest because of the people are so dangerous, right? So it's imagined that that actually it's not recognized that the actual investments in those communities, like any other community, could actually reduce any levels of violence. But then the second reason is it's just about power, right? You have people who hold the purse strings, who, whether from the business community or political community, who is using their power to not shift funds and resources into Black communities. And we need to hold those people accountable or drive them out of power.
Absolutely. While traveling and highlighting the topic of anti-racism, what types of best practices have you seen along the way which have encouraged you?
I mean, there's been so many, but I think the best practice of just witnessing people being deeply self-reflective, the best practice of witnessing organizations say, you know what, a more equitable organization, as studies show, will allow us to be more efficient, will allow us to be more productive. And indeed, if it's a business-related organization, studies show will allow them to be more profitable. And so people actually having intelligent self-interest.
Cultural institutions have the ability to legitimize or exclude contributions to the creativity of our society. Have you seen or researched any tactics that arts organizations could do to help amplify underrepresented, diverse artists?
Well, I mean, let me just first and foremost say that those cultural organizations that are creating spaces and opportunities for underrepresented artists to create art that is nestled within their culture is just absolutely critically important. And when I say nestled in their culture, not underrepresented artists who are creating art for white consumption. I'm specifically speaking about underrepresented artists who are creating art, right? Based on their lived experience, based on their expertise, that we will all, people of color and white people, will appreciate it. I mean, cultural organizations that are doing that are really at the forefront.
All right, so I've got one question here, sort of clarification on something from earlier. How could someone be called white supremacist when we mentioned that there are whites creating policies or advocating for things that impact their own race negatively? So could you explain this to someone who identifies as white?
That's what I'm trying to figure out. So I can't explain it. All I know is that these are people who are advocating for white supremacy, right? They're organizing white supremacist organizations. That's on over here. And then over here, these are the specific policies that they're advocating, policies that are actually harming white people. These are the specific historical figures, whether Confederates or Nazis, that they're championing, people who actually who actually led to a significant amount of white people dying. That's the enduring paradox. And I think the more white people themselves realize that white supremacists are actually based specifically on the effects of their policies, are actually anti-white. Once they realize that those of us who are actually anti-racist, who are advocating for equity and justice for everyone. In other words, you have white supremacists who are not advocating against police violence because in their mind, that's just, it's just Black and brown people dying. Well, white people are dying at higher rates from police violence in this country than white people in other countries, right? So, but again, there isn't, in order for people to truly advocate for what's best for white people, they have to advocate for what's best for people. and I think that's one of the reasons why so many white people have been hoodwinked into supporting organizations and individuals on the basis of whiteness, when indeed those people were actually not advocating for their best interests.
All right, so an audience member says that James Baldwin talks about how being a conscious Black man can put you in a constant state of rage. How do you keep your peace and hopeful mindset when you've dedicated your life to learning about trauma and the challenges of Black people?
So in many ways, I think rage is extremely healthy. I mean, I think when we saw the brutal murder of Tyre Nichols, I think it was extremely healthy for people to be enraged by what they saw. But what I try to do is sort of tunnel or control my rage into mechanisms that will create a more just society. And in many ways, I try to allow that rage to exist side by side hope. So I'm enraged that injustice is persisting, but I'm hopeful that we can abolish it.
So I've got a question, Dr. Kendi. Here at Metro United Way, we believe that philanthropic investment needs to move beyond crisis funding and that philanthropic giving should increase to meet community needs of those affected by historic systemic racism. How can an anti-racism lens benefit the philanthropic landscape in communities across the nation?
Sure. So to not overly simplify it, but I guess we don't have that much time. There's largely two philanthropic approaches to, let's say, racial disparities. Let's say, for instance, in a particular community, it's widely known that Black people are dying, that Black women are dying at higher rates in pregnancy than white women. There's two approaches to that crisis. One approach is to imagine that Black women are dying at higher rates than white women in pregnancy because of something that Black women are doing wrong during or after pregnancy. In other words, it's the result of their behavior, or there's something about their lack of education, or there's something wrong with them. The other approach is to say, no, there's actually something structural here. It's actually the result of racism. So if you're a philanthropic organization and you believe that Black women are causing their own deaths at higher rates, then you're going to support behavioral and educational enrichment programs for those Black women. So they'll just act better in pregnancy, and it's imagined that that will reduce those rates. But if you recognize there's nothing wrong with Black women, pregnant women, then you'll invest in organizations that are trying to figure out the policies and practices that are actually causing that. And let me give an even more salient example. We have a racial wealth gap in this country. You have organizations that are funding, quote, financial literacy programs in Black communities, even though studies show when you control for income, Black people are actually not more or less financially illiterate than white people. When you control for income, they're actually just as likely to make good or bad investments as white people. So that's actually not going to do anything to close the racial wealth gap, because it actually hasn't opened because of Black financial illiteracy. And then you have other organizations that are actually trying to change conditions and structures that were actually the cause of this racial wealth gap.
Thank you so much. Audience, thank you for your questions. If you've got a question that didn't get answered, like I said, please email us at events@metrounitedway.org, and we will get to those. Dr. Kendi, thank you so much for this important conversation with us and for your time. Now we're going to hear closing remarks from Metro United Way's Chief Impact and Equity Officer, Robert Gunn.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you, Trent. Excellent job asking the questions. And it goes without being said, Dr. Kendi, thank you so very much for spending this time with us. The level of enlightenment and engagement that I think that I saw personally, we truly thank you from the bottom of our hearts, from the greater Louisville region, as well as everyone who has joined us today. I also wanted to thank you because in listening to you today, I appreciated the elevation that you raised in how denial has been at the pulse of racism, which caused me to then think about and consider how powerful denial can be when we discuss things like race or even grief, or like you talked about earlier, your health and a myriad of other things. But what I would call, despite the fact that many aspects of our history have been proven to be horrendous, I appreciated the fact that you told us today that there are opportunities for hope and also healing if we choose to face the fact that racism does exist, but even more importantly, if we choose as individuals to be anti-racists. So I thank you for that. Also wanted to say thank you to everyone for participating and those who have donated to our DE&I work here at Metro United Way. Thank you again to the LG&E KU Foundation. I invite everyone to please visit our website for more information and upcoming opportunities to engage in this important work that will take us all forward and help us work better together so we can all succeed. Finally, please be on the lookout for the future 2023 Beyond Buzzwords speaker series. We will have 2 more exciting speakers to join the series this year that will be announced soon. Please be on the lookout for more information. And last but not least, one more time, Dr. Kendi, you are not in the room with me right now, my brother, but I'm giving you a standing ovation. I truly appreciate everything that you shared with us today. Thank you, my friend. And I hope that many people in our audience learn from you today, and not just learn and listen, but also are willing to make any changes necessary to help us all become better. So thank you again. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.